Good afternoon. Welcome to the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center's Fall Climate Academy's webinar on New York's Comprehensive State and Local Climate Resilience Program. I'm Marjorie Kaplan, and I'm both Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague Jean Herb of the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. A few logistics. Today's webinar will last until 1:15. Other than today's presenters and our Rutgers team, you're all muted. So to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little bubble that says chat, and if you click on that, you can send us questions and comments. Please send your notes to all panelists, as that ensures all of us working behind the scenes today will see your questions. Thanks to my colleagues Matt Drews, Carrie Ferraro here at Rutgers for their help with today's webinar. We welcome your thoughts and questions. I also want to let you know we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center website, which we'll put into the chat box. I see Carrie's already done that. One continuing ed credit is available through the Association of State Floodplain Management, and 1.25 certification maintenance credits are available through the American Planning Association. Reach out to us after the webinar if you need a certificate, or just put it in the chat box. We are very, very pleased today to have two wonderful colleagues from the state of New York who will give us a primer on new guidance and standards for flood risk management, infrastructure siting and design guidelines, and model local laws under New York's Community Risk and Resilience Act. First, we're going to hear from Mark Lowery, a 32-year veteran of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Mark is the Assistant Director of DEC's Office of Climate Change, and he's been there since 2007 as one of that office's original staff members. His principal areas of responsibility have included leading public outreach efforts for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, State Sea Level Rise Task Force, and climate action planning. He's overseen development of the state's principal program to support municipal climate action, Climate Smart Communities, and he's led implementation of the Community Risk and Resilience Act. Mark holds a bachelor's degree in biology from Franklin and Marshall College and a master's degree in environmental and forest biology from the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And after Mark's finished, we're going to hear from Barbara Kendall. Barbara is a coastal resilience specialist with the New York State Department of State, Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure, where she works with communities on local waterfront revitalization programs, plans, and implementation projects. Barbara has a master's degree from Duke University in forest ecology and a bachelor's degree in biology from Williams College. I'd like to remind everyone again to put your questions in the chat box to all panelists, and it's now my pleasure to invite my colleague Mark Lowery to turn on his camera, his microphone, share his screen, and to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjorie. And I think the slides are running now, so I will get started. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and thanks to the audience for being here. New York State, as many states in the Northeast in particular, has seen a trend of increasing losses due to floods over recent decades. And in response to this trend, and in particular to the damage and death caused by Tropical Storm Lee and Hurricanes Irene and Sandy, New York State enacted the Community Risk and Resiliency Act in 2014. And I will refer to Community Risk and Resiliency Act most often as CARA. CARA required, among other things, that applicants for permits for major projects, as defined in New York State law, major projects in a small number of DEC regulatory programs demonstrate that they had considered future physical risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding in their project designs. In 2019, New York State enacted the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The primary focus of the Climate Leadership Act is to set greenhouse gas emission limits for 2030 and 2050. But it also made some significant amendments to the original language of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. Now, I'll discuss the remaining requirements listed here on this slide as I proceed through this presentation. But please note, despite the name Community Risk and Resiliency Act, this law does not require local governments to do anything, including to make amendments to their local floodplain ordinances or to their building codes. The CLCPA, when it was enacted in 2019, expanded the scope of the original Community Risk and Resiliency Act in two important ways. It expanded the list of permit programs that were covered by CARA from a small handful to cover almost all DEC discretionary permit programs. The newly added programs are listed here or are underlined in this particular slide. This change means, for instance, that flood risk might be a consideration for a project that is located outside the current jurisdictional area of a water-related permit, for instance, our tidal wetlands permit program, but is applying for, say, a Title V air pollution permit. And in fact, the first applications of CARA have been through requiring sea level rise considerations for projects that were applying for air pollution permits. And the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act expanded the list of climate hazards that must be considered by applicants in these permit programs, from the original sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding to essentially all climate hazards, climate change writ large, if you will. As originally written, CARA only required applicants to, quote, demonstrate consideration of future flood risk without providing DEC with any explicit authority to require mitigation of risk through denial or conditioning of a permit beyond what may have been already conferred by DEC by the individual program's original authorizing statute. The CLCPA amended CARA to specifically authorize DEC to require mitigation of climate risk to just about any community, natural resource, or other asset other than the applicant's own property. The original CARA also requires that applicants to several state funding programs also demonstrate consideration of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. This requirement was not itself explicitly changed by the CLCPA to expand the scope of hazards that must be considered in these programs. And most significantly affected of these programs are probably the two revolving funds through which the state supports construction and upgrades to municipal water infrastructure, and the Department of State's local waterfront revitalization programs. The original CARA language also requires DEC to consider amending the regulations of 3 of its facility siting programs to mitigate risk associated with sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. DEC has not yet made such amendments to these regulations, however, pending adoption of technical guidance that I will be describing in a few moments. CARA also required DEC to promulgate a regulation adopting official state sea level rise projections, which we completed in 2017. DEC chose to adopt projections completed by researchers at Columbia University for the NYSERDA-funded Climate Integrated Assessment, which had been updated in 2014. We chose these projections, which include projections of relative sea level rise for 3 areas of the state of New York, Long Island, New York City, and the lower Hudson and the mid Hudson, for 3 time slices in 2100 as the best available projections specific to New York State. And importantly, they are consistent with projections adopted for New York City by the New York City Panel on Climate Change. We are required to update these projections every 5 years under the statute, but this regulation does nothing more than provide projections. The regulation in and of itself does not require their use in any circumstance by anybody. But we do provide sea level rise mappers for the entire state, and we'll put the links for those mappers in the chat box. CARA required DEC to issue guidance for the use of natural resources and nature-based features to reduce risks of flooding and for implementation of the statute. The statute, however, is not specific as to what the implementation guidance should include. In the end, DEC developed 3 guidance documents on consideration of flood and sea level rise risk, as well as the natural resilience measures guidance, and released all 4 on November 4th, 2020. And we will provide links to those documents in the chat as well. Before I describe the guidance documents in detail, I would like to explain the thinking behind their development. Remember that CARA's focus is only on DEC's permits, facility siting regulations, and some state investments. To a large extent, CARA presented DEC with the challenge of incorporating consideration of future flood conditions into programs, most of which already use the boundary of the FEMA special flood hazard area as a jurisdictional or regulatory line in the base flood elevation, that is the elevation of the 1% annual chance flood, as the basis of the minimum design for the minimum design flood elevation. Our approach was to identify guideline elevations as alternatives to the BFE, base flood elevation, that would in turn be used to define alternatives to the special flood hazard area, the 1% annual chance floodplain, as the jurisdictional areas for programs affected by CARA. This was the same challenge the Obama administration attempted to address when it released Executive Order 13690 at about the same time we were beginning to think about how to implement CARA. EO 13690 created a new federal flood risk management standard that would have applied to federal investments, although it would not have applied to the National Flood Insurance Program. We chose to model New York State's flood risk management guidelines on the criteria included in that federal EO 13690. The Trump administration rescinded EO 13690, but that rescission has no bearing on New York's use of it as a model. Interestingly, I understand that numerous advocacy groups are now advising President-elect Biden to restore this executive order upon taking office. EO 13690 included 3 criteria and allowed for federal agencies to choose one by which to define the floodplain for their program's purposes. Our guidance is based on the same criteria, although we treat them somewhat differently than 13690 would have. I need to emphasize, though, that the definition of a floodplain based on any of these criteria is relevant only to programs covered by the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. And I'll just review these 3 criteria quickly. The first of the criteria, and the most straightforward, is the area and elevation of the 0.2% annual chance flood, popularly known as the 500-year flood. Use of this criterion has the advantage of being mapped for some areas on FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, which means that additional modeling and mapping are not required to apply it, but it is not available for all areas. The second criterion is based on an extension of a water surface elevation to its intersection with the ground to define the jurisdictional extent of the floodplain. New York State's Uniform Code already requires 2 feet of freeboard for most buildings located in the 1% floodplain, and most permit programs covered by CARA apply a similar requirement. However, any special requirements for construction apply only within the 1% floodplain, that is, the area defined by the base flood elevation. This criterion involves, applying the second criterion, involves adding the freeboard requirement to the base flood elevation and then extending that jurisdiction to include the entire extended floodplain, essentially expanding the horizontal extent of the jurisdictional area in recognition of the fact that just because a project is 6 inches beyond the special flood hazard area, its flood risk does not go to 0. Finally, Executive Order 13690 provided for the use of a climate-informed science elevation to define the floodplain, but that executive order provided no guidance on how such an elevation should be determined. Our objective in developing the climate-informed science guideline for New York State was to maintain the same risk profile under future conditions that we have now. In other words, in permit and funding programs where flooding is a concern, we generally accept a 1% annual risk of some flooding, and we add freeboard to account for local conditions that could cause higher waters in some areas of the floodplain. One could argue that this is too much or too little risk tolerance, but it is the conventional standard. The climate-informed science guideline attempts to approximate this risk tolerance given reasonable assumptions about future flood conditions. The climate-informed science guideline, as we have described it in New York State, consists of 3 components. In most cases, the base flood elevation or some other applicable design criterion. For some structures, an alternative criteria are used, especially with transportation infrastructure, but most often it's the base flood elevation, a climate change component, and freeboard. These 3 In our application, these three elevations are simply summed to calculate the guideline elevation, and this elevation is extended to its intersection with the ground to determine the extent of the flood risk management area, as we saw in the previous example. In tidal areas, the climate change component would be the sea level rise projection for that area over the expected service life of the project. Since DEC's sea level rise projections include 5 different rate of rise scenarios, the flood risk management guidance specifies which scenarios should be considered for specific types of projects. Generally, our guidance recommends application of the medium scenario for most structures and the high scenario for critical infrastructure and facilities. For non-tidal environments, future flows will be estimated by increasing current design flows, most often the 1% annual chance flow, by 10% in the western part of the state or by 20% in the eastern part of the state. These values represent the approximate increase in the volume of the 1% annual chance flows that has already been observed in New York State and is anticipated to continue in the near future. Once these projected peak flows are calculated, modeling can be used to estimate the flood elevation and extent at the site of interest, but it is also often possible to estimate the elevation of the projected floodplain, the future floodplain, using flows that are provided in the flood insurance study data. DEC's flood risk management guidance document is intended to provide non-binding technical guidance to agencies and program units responsible for the programs referenced in the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. It recommends flood risk management guidelines for each of a variety of building and infrastructure types. Agencies and units responsible for programs covered by CARA would then incorporate those recommended guidelines into program-specific guidance and perhaps operating regulations consistent with each program's authorizing statute and with DEC's new authority to require mitigation of flood risk. The guidance document includes a primer on flood risk management, written primarily for staff who are not normally required to assess flood risk. And I'll note that CARA confers new responsibilities on DEC staff to assess flood risk in ways that they had not done before. So we determined that we needed to provide additional background information in that regard. And the guidance document includes tables that list the applicable guideline elevations for each of many structure types, including transportation infrastructure, an excerpt of which I show here for buildings. But as I mentioned, we also address transportation infrastructure. And in fact, the New York State Department of Transportation has already incorporated these guidelines into the New York State Bridge Manual, which guides design and construction of virtually all bridges in New York State. The recommended guidelines would also be available for voluntary use by state planning, regulatory, or funding programs that are not covered by the Community Risk and Resiliency Act. And although the Community Risk and Resiliency Act does not require municipalities to adopt code or zoning to reflect the flood risk management guidelines, they can do so. I won't dwell on the details, and Barbara will get into this in a few moments, but New York State municipalities have options that include adopting a freeboard requirement, more protective than the 2 feet currently required by New York State, extending the area in which the freeboard requirement applies beyond the 1% floodplain, or adopting a design flood elevation that is greater than the base flood elevation, possibly by adjusting for sea level rise or those modeled future riverine flows. The Department of State's model local laws to increase resilience provide language that can be used for 2 of these 3 options, and Barbara Kendall from the DOS will describe these model local laws in a few minutes. DEC has also further explained these options in material provided through its Climate Smart Community Certification Program. We have provided a brief document to describe how one might estimate each of the guideline elevations under different circumstances using available maps and sea level rise viewers. And we have issued so-called smart growth guidance. New York State's smart growth public let me start again. I apologize. New York State Smart Growth Public Infrastructure Policy Act was enacted in 2010 and prohibits any New York State agency or authority from undertaking, funding, approving, or supporting a public infrastructure project that does not meet a set of smart growth criteria defined or listed in the law. If an agency or authority determines that a project is inconsistent with any of these criteria, but decides to proceed with the project anyway, it must issue an attestation as to why the project is necessary and why the agency cannot, or why the project cannot be designed consistent with those smart growth criteria. CARA amended the smart growth law to add mitigation of sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding to the list of criteria that must be considered. The smart growth guidance document is directed to the public infrastructure agencies and essentially advises them to apply the flood risk management guidance guidelines in their required smart growth assessments. CARA recognized that natural resilience measures can both reduce risk and offer very important co-benefits that can't be achieved with a seawall or bulkhead, and required DEC, in consultation with the Department of State, to develop guidance on the use of natural resources and natural processes to reduce risk. And this natural resilience measures guidance was the fourth of the 4 guidances we released in November. The document is designed primarily as a reference that DEC staff can use to encourage applicants for flood and erosion control projects to consider use of green infrastructure rather than gray. The natural resilience measures guidance identifies 20 natural resources and nature-based features that reduce risk of erosion and flooding, or that should be protected as naturally protected. The guidance document includes detailed information on the use of each natural resilience measure or protective feature in reducing the risk of flooding and erosion. And it's our hope that the availability of this information will facilitate adoption of these measures by applicants and by the design community. Turning back now to applying the flood risk management guidance in our permit programs. DEC issues more than 10,000 permits a year and cannot complete a detailed flood risk assessment for each one, nor is sea level rise or flooding a significant concern for most of them. The challenge of reviewing permits for flood risk is exacerbated by the fact that there are no maps of inland riverine floodplains defined by any of the guideline elevations. DEC has adopted a procedure that we think will allow us to focus attention on those projects where sea level rise and flooding are of major concern as we develop resources and capacity to provide more robust reviews of a wider portion of permit applications. Currently, the DEC's Division of Environmental Permits, which coordinates review of virtually all permits, applications that DEC receives, will screen applications for projects in a limited number of project types that I posted here on the slide when they are proposed for either the 0.2% floodplain or in tidal areas, the 1% floodplain with 6 feet of sea level rise. Projects would not necessarily be required to be sited or built to this level of protection, but this approach allows us to cast a wide net in identifying those projects where more detailed site-specific analysis of flood risk is warranted. For these screened projects, Office of Climate Change staff assist permit review and program staff in applying the guideline elevations to develop design elevations for the proposed project. These elevations are then communicated to the applicants, preferably before the application is submitted, so they can be incorporated into project siting and design early in the process. And we have added a screening layer for tidal areas to our public-facing website to assist in that process. And our permit review staff have access to the sea level rise mappers on DEC's internal GIS system that's used for screening of permit applications. One of the challenges to implementing CARA's requirement that applicants consider flood risk, and even more so to potential municipal incorporation of the flood risk guidelines into local floodplain ordinances, is the lack of mapping. Calculating a design elevation by adding projected sea level rise to the base flood elevation as if it were additional freeboard is fairly straightforward, and sea level rise mappers can provide a rough estimate of the area of the future affected area. But firms do not show riverine floodplains defined by horizontal extension of base flood elevation plus freeboard, and FEMA has not yet determined how it will incorporate future conditions into flood insurance studies or flood insurance rate maps. Left then to our own devices, our office funded an add-on to an ongoing DEC project in which the firm Dewberry was using base level engineering to map floodplains in 2 New York State counties. As part of this project, Dewberry evaluated 7 floodplain designations that might be used to map riverine flood hazard areas based on the guideline elevations described in the State Flood Risk Management Guidance document. Dewberry used existing base level engineering analysis to delineate the 100-year or the 100-year plus, which is essentially the upper end of the 90% confidence interval for projected 100-year flood elevations, and the 500-year floodplains. They conducted new base level engineering analysis to project floodplains based on the 10% and 20% increases in 1% annual chance flows, and developed a Python-based mapping tool to project floodplains defined by the horizontal extension of BFE plus 2 feet and of 3 feet. The technical report is not from Dewberry, is not available online, but I am happy to provide it upon request. And I won't get into the technical detail, but I will note that interestingly, in general, at least the study areas in these 2 counties involved in this project, the extent of the 0.2, one of the questions we were trying to answer was, how do these various guidelines stack up, these guideline elevations stack up in terms of the amount of area that they actually would describe. The extent of the 0.2% floodplain was approximately equal to the upper bound of the 90% confidence interval for delineation of the 1% floodplain. Projected floodplains based on flow multipliers, our climate-informed science approach to projecting future floodplains, fell within that confidence interval of current methods to delineate the 100-year floodplain. Approaches based on an extension of the base flood elevation and freeboard resulted in the largest increases in extent. Dewberry also evaluated the ability of a statistical model using 19 variables to delineate floodplains in areas lacking a flood insurance study, which could be useful in generating flood maps where current maps are outdated. We are continuing to evaluate the results of this study, but it appears unlikely that the mapping approaches evaluated provide sufficient resolution to serve as regulatory replacements to flood insurance rate maps. Maps of projected floodplains based on an extension of BFE plus 2 feet or 3 feet developed using GIS methods for the entire state could serve as screening tools for permitting purposes, as do the sea level rise mappers, but we will need to consider whether this use could justify the cost of generating such maps statewide to screen for the relatively small number of projects to which CARA restrictions actually apply. We are not familiar with similar comparisons of the potential regulatory effects of different floodplain designations done elsewhere, and these results will be useful as we continue to develop policies and programs to reduce flood risk in New York State. And I will finish that and turn it back to Marjorie.
Thanks so much, Mark. That was really fantastic, and we're very grateful. So now I'd like to invite Barbara to turn on your screen and start sharing your slides and unmute and take it away.
Okay. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? All righty.
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So as Mark mentioned, one of the requirements of the Community Risk and Resiliency Act was to develop some model local laws for communities. So the Department of State worked with DEC and other partners to create a suite of model local laws, and the purpose is to help local governments be more resilient to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. We recognize the importance of local government and decision making every day about millions of dollars worth of property, especially in coastal areas and along rivers. So these model local laws were created from three basic different sources: existing model laws, such as DEC's floodplain model laws and stormwater laws, and especially good examples of current local laws from New York State communities and also other states. We recognize that some communities are already doing a good job, so we adapted those and made them generic so that other communities can use them. And sometimes we combine sections from various laws to address particular topics related to community resiliency. And the idea is that these could be adapted for local use either by plugging in sections to existing laws or using an entire model law for topics that might not be addressed by that community. There's 5 chapters in this document. It's over 400 pages, a big effort by staff. The chapters are basic land use tools for resiliency. This talks about zoning, setbacks, subdivision, etc. Wetland and water course protection, which is setbacks, buffers, overlay districts, also some zoning standards. 3 is coastal shoreline protection measures, high erosion areas, buffers, hard structure alternatives, etc. 4 is management of floodplain development, and 5 is stormwater control measures. So I'm going to go through a little bit from each of those. There's the website, and I think it's also going to be put in the chat box for this big document of all these model local laws. So when we decided to do this effort, we realized that communities might need a way to decide where to start. How do we decide how to assess our local laws and figure out what we need? So we worked with EPA and FEMA to develop a local assessment tool. Basically, EPA spearheaded this effort that will help local governments decide what model laws might be right for them. It's called the CRISE Implementation Strategic Enhancements Tool. It's organized by 7 resilience goals: assess risk, avoid risk, reduce, develop safely, manage stormwater, build capacity, build community support. It has a lot of references from throughout the United States as examples of how tools can build resilience, and especially has a checklist of local programs, policies, and codes. So this can be used by any state to assist local governments in assessing what they have and what they need. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to use these 7 goals to talk about the different model local laws we've chosen from this big document. So it's organized by these goals. The first goal is model local laws to assess risk. So ideas for this are, the first one is a coastal erosion-based setback. And what would happen with this amendment to a local law or amendment to zoning would be that the community uses a science-based approach to use erosion rate and the projected life expectancy of a structure to determine the appropriate setback. So this is, a calculation-based approach. The model was drawn from the Woods Hole Sea Grant, Barnstable County, Massachusetts, and Cape Cod Commission And the University of Hawaii Sea Grant developed a model based on this. So you can see a lot of our references came from many different areas of the United States. 3.4.1 is a special use permit alternatives analysis. So the planning board, at least in New York State, the planning board could authorize a community to apply for, or an applicant to apply for a special use permit to demonstrate why they need a hard structural measure. Why do they have to do the action at all? Why can't they use nature-based features or natural features? And then if these are insufficient, why do they have to use a structural measure? So they have to go through that analysis to get a special use permit for what they want to do. The third one is a shoreline reach analysis. And I put a little bit more information about this. This is based on the town of East Hampton on Long Island in New York. In East Hampton, they have a lot of shoreline area, which is different characteristics in the north and the south. So what they did is they studied that, and then they divided their community into these 4 different colored zone areas. And basically, in the highest hazard, there'd be no erosion control structures, new ones allowed, or some areas a permit were required, other areas limited repair. So it's based on assessment of your community, and then it would be an overlay district to have these areas. The next goal is model local laws to avoid risk. So this is things like cluster, open space, and conservation development. The first one was adopted from the city of Saratoga Springs, New York, that has a really good cluster development ordinance. 3.1.3 is shoreline protection outside of coastal erosion hazard areas. And in New York, we have what are called CHAs, coastal erosion hazard areas, regulated by DEC. But we know that outside of those areas can still be high hazard areas for erosion, even if they're not mapped and regulated by DEC. So this allows a community to adopt an overlay district in those high hazard areas by amending the zoning law and regulate use and development in those additional areas. And that's adapted from the town of Hamlin, New York. The third one in this group is watercourse setbacks. And some of you may have seen this graphic before. This has been around for a long time. But in this, you can, the community can adopt a standard setback of specific widths from the center line of the stream, and then maintain a buffer to decrease erosion and reduce flood risk in those areas along the streams. In my community, we have this as a stream corridor overlay district in my town of Dover. The next goal is model local laws to reduce risk. And this gets into subdivision regulations where the community can require disclosure of the flood hazard area on the subdivision plat. That's 1.5.7, and there's an example of that. It actually comes from Montana in the document. 4.3.8 is would be an amendment to the flood damage prevention law, and 4.3.2. These two are amendments to the standard FEMA flood damage prevention law that I imagine New Jersey probably uses a similar one for communities that want to be in the flood insurance program. They have to have a local law, but there's ways you can make that better. So DEC has developed standard models with amendments. The first one is to require dry land access for new buildings, like this one on the left that was from my town when I was on the zoning board, and it was built but never finished, and there was no way to get to it. And then establishing design flood elevation would again be an amendment to the FEMA flood damage prevention law. And this is just a picture, graphic of that, similar to what Mark talked about. The community can require a higher base flood elevation, and then the freeboard gets stacked on top of that to protect areas that we know might not currently be being protected by the base flood elevation on the firm maps. The next next goal is model local laws to develop safely. And the first one, 4.3.6, that again would be an amendment to the flood damage prevention law, prohibit new critical facilities in flood zones like fire stations, nursing homes, hospitals, community centers. That can be an amendment to the flood damage prevention law. The second one is non-conversion agreements under elevated buildings. So in this picture, all these buildings were elevated, but what if, after 10 years that homeowner says, oh, I'm going to put a playroom down there. I'm going to close that off. Well, this would require them to sign an agreement at the time of that elevation that they will only save that space for parking, building access, and limited storage. And then the third one is safe building envelopes and subdivisions. The subdivision law is saying there has to be an envelope outside of the floodplain on each lot in a subdivision. The next one is model local laws to manage stormwater. The Chapter 5 has all sorts of stormwater ideas. There's a couple here from the first chapter, basic provisions, maximum lot coverage, requiring maximum impervious surface on a lot. You can only have so much pavement and buildings because stormwater can't go into the ground and increases flooding. The second one is prohibiting encroachments on drainage ways so that we don't block the flow of that stormwater. That example actually came from Illinois. And then the third group here is model stormwater management and erosion and sediment control laws. In New York, I actually helped with this effort back when I worked at DEC, before I worked at Department of State, that there's model local laws for stormwater management. About maybe 8 years after those models were developed, we realized we needed more models for impaired waters and for community resilience. So those models were improved for plug-in provisions for communities that also want to require a green infrastructure enhancement program for any development. Then the sixth goal is model local laws to build capacity. The beach erosion control districts comes from the town of Southampton. A lot of these are from Long Island because I have a lot of problems down there. And the funds from the district are used for beach nourishment, which they found is what they really need. Taxes based on linear waterfront frontage or on assessed value or a combination. Stormwater utility, this basically means that you would generate a fee for impervious surface, which then goes into a fund, which can allow for funding stormwater management programs. And then the third one is a phased reconstruction moratorium to help communities provide for rapid disaster repairs while maintaining a reasonable amount of time to assess the situation and make smart decisions. So that goes into local law to just allow for that time. Then the last one, I believe, is model local laws to build community support. And basically this is incentives to have people buy into protecting for floodplain management. So the first one is allowing increased maximum building height. So instead of having to go to the zoning board to get a variance for, allow when they elevate their building, then it's above the height requirement for that zone. This would allow for that. And then the second one, design requirement, says, okay, we're going to elevate buildings, but let's allow for or even require visual mitigation. So if you see in this bottom picture, the stairs go at a right angle, there's lattice work and porches to make it more visually appealing when they elevate the building. Okay, so that's it. This is our contact information. And now I think we're going into questions and discussion.
Thank you, Barbara and Mark. You guys have covered an enormous amount of information in a very short period of time. But I'm glad to see Mark has joined us. Carrie Ferraro, I'd like to invite my colleague to unmute herself. There she is. Carrie's been diligently following questions that have been submitted in the chat, and she is going to moderate our session and ask you some questions. Thank you. Take it away, Carrie.
Thanks, Marjorie, and thank you so much, Mark and Barbara, for your wonderful presentations. So we had a number of questions in the chat. One is to both of you. Did you do any economic modeling to determine what the cost versus benefits of any of these programs were? And specifically, Barbara, can you please address, have model laws been shown to reduce flood insurance or potentially increase property values?
I'm not sure whether any economic, in fact, I don't think that any economic modeling was done by our department as part of this model local law effort. But there are some references within the document. There's a lot of resources in there. And there's a couple of these provisions that talk about, they allow points in the community rating system, which is a system the community can apply for to reduce the flood insurance for their residents. So several of the ones that I talked about are one of those lines in the community rating system that can allow for reduction of flood insurance. So I'd have to look back and then pull out which ones they were, but.
DEC did not do any economic analysis, and remember, and I've harped on this a bit, this really only applies to DEC permit programs, which doesn't include in general, the average person building a house outside the floodplain, or frankly, even within the floodplain, because that's in New York regulated by the municipalities. So there is language in the guidance document that allows consideration of costs on that sort of case-by-case basis that we anticipated, where we anticipated this guidance would actually be most often applied.
Thank you both. Barbara, Alan Krantz asked, do the model laws help communities balance two competing public policies, flood risk reduction and preserving historic buildings and sites that are located within flood-prone areas? I know you talked a little bit about raising houses, but is there anything else you'd like to say about that?
There are a couple other ones I didn't include in the presentation today, but about design guidelines and working within historic districts, of how to address that. And there's, again, several resource links in this document about historic preservation and how that works with FEMA. And there's also provisions in the FEMA flood damage prevention law about working with historic districts. So, I would invite the person asking the question to delve into this document and look for some of those resources.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Sorry, I muted myself by accident. That's very helpful. Thank you. So what sort of assistance, this may be addressed to both of you, is New York giving to communities, especially communities that might not be as wealthy, to implement resiliency? So what kind of maybe social equity measures are being put into place?
My office does make available in most years through its Climate Smart Communities program. We have a grants program that really focuses on adaptation and resilience. We don't, under the law, actually cannot, with this money, fund things like solar panels. We can support mitigation outside the power sector, but most of the funds are used to support either adaptation and resilience projects, things we've funded, relocation of emergency operations centers outside of the floodplain and things like that. And we do give some preference to those projects that are located in currently defined environmental justice areas in New York State, or are being applied for by municipalities that have lower income. We are under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. There is a requirement that the value of the benefits that accrue from implementation of that act as with regard to energy efficiency would at least 35 and up to 40%, or with a goal of 40% of those benefits would accrue to communities that will be identified as disadvantaged. And there's a process ongoing to determine how we are going to define the disadvantaged community. Our program, the Climate Smart Communities program, probably isn't directly affected by that, but I think for many programs, in the spirit of the CLCPA, we are going to be looking to direct at least 35 to 40% of the benefits of our program to disadvantaged communities. And frankly, we have already determined that the majority of our funds through the Climate Smart Communities program, at least, actually go to municipalities that have less than 80% of the median household income in New York.
Our grant program as well, I work with the local waterfront revitalization program. We have a grant program. It's for certain designated areas of community in the coastal area and on designated inland waterways, but we do prioritize a certain amount of that fund be used in environmental justice areas based on the income level of the census tract. That's how it's determined. So we do prioritize that. We do find that in most years we don't reach the maximum of the amount that we've allocated. So then the money goes to other communities, but we do get some applications from communities in that category.
Thank you both so much. That was really helpful, and it actually addressed a number of questions that came in the chat. So thank you both. So our next question to both of you is kind of about outreach that you've done and community reaction. So what kind of what actions have you taken to more broadly share some of these guidance documents and recommendations? And what has been the reaction among stakeholders?
Barbara, you want to go first?
Sure. So the presentation that I gave this is actually only the third time I've done it since last November. The last November I gave one out in the western part of the state to a local government conference. Another sister unit in the Department of State is the local government program, and they do training all over the state for planning and zoning boards and local governments. So I did it as part of one of their conferences that they do periodically. So we're hoping we'll continue to partner with them to get the word out on this. It's kind of like a partnership. You know, I know more about the environmental part of it. They know more, you know, about some of the nuts and bolts of local land use. So putting our heads together will hopefully get the word out there more. Also, through our local waterfront revitalization program, communities can develop what we call LWRPs. And we now, one whole category in our grant program is improving those LWRPs to incorporate climate risk and resiliency. So we have these tools right on our website. And when we sign a contract with a community for an LWRP, we'll give them the guidance and say, here, they have to implement an LWRP with local laws. That's how it's done. So that's another way that takes time, because it takes several years to get these LWRPs done. But over time, we're hoping that's how these can get incorporated.
From DEC's perspective in developing the other three guidance documents that were released in November, prior to release, during development, we did a lot of outreach to stakeholders. I would have to estimate that I gave over 100 presentations to professional organizations, stakeholder organizations, local business groups, state business groups. Virtually anyone who asked for a presentation on the Community Risk and Resiliency Act got one, whether they decided they really wanted it or not after they got it. And then even though these were not strictly regulatory documents, they're not regulations, we treated them as if they were. So we released, there was notice in the Environmental Notice Bulletin in New York State, went through a formal public comment period, took comments. Actually, we did that twice. We went through 2 public comments on the main document, the flood risk management guidance. I can't say there has been a lot of reaction after the final release. I did mention that the release date was November 4th, and there were other things going on in the nation that day, that being the day after Election Day. So I only saw it get picked up by one media outlet. And again, the range of stakeholders who were actually directly affected is quite small. It is, if you look back to that slide of the projects for which we apply this is people building, bulk storage facilities and that kind of thing. It's not the average homeowner.
Thank you so much. So this is a question, I think, for Barbara. Have you been able to do any evaluation to understand what aspects of your program have been most helpful to communities? I know it sounds like it's fairly new, but
A broader question. Yeah, not specifically the model local laws, but our local waterfront revitalization program, we periodically do a survey of communities. We did one, I think, maybe a year ago. And it's kind of, well, the thing they like the most is the staff. They like staff because what we do when it's not COVID, we go out to communities, sit with them, go to their meetings while they're developing their local waterfront program, talk about local laws because they have to be implemented by them. And one thing I want to mention is always work with the local attorney, municipal attorney, because they're really important in getting these laws done. But anyway, they really like we did a new guidance document on local waterfront, how to develop an LWRP, which includes information about resiliency. It was before the model local laws were done, but includes a lot of what Mark talked about. New York guidelines for sea level rise and flooding and increased rainfall. So we had that in there. So they liked our guidance documents. They like our staff. Nothing specific to these local laws, but the assistance that we provide communities is very well received.
I'll chime in on that again, not from the perspective of this particular program, but from what we hear from the participants in our Climate Smart Communities program. And I'm also involved in implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. And as part of that planning, we're doing having a lot of conversations with local officials. And while we often hear, yes, we need more money, we hear, I think even more often, that boots on the ground that can provide technical support to supplement existing staff, whether you call them circuit riders or, as we do here in New York, regional coordinators, which are currently funded by NYSERDA. DEC will soon have another group of funded coordinators to provide direct technical assistance on the ground to municipalities. And that we hear all the time is vital to these overstrapped municipalities to take on something that often isn't necessarily required of them by law, but that they would like to do.
yeah, makes sense. Thank you so much. So Mark, there was a question about, will the permit evaluations ever go to existing facilities, or are they for new or permits that are being renewals? I couldn't figure out that word. Sorry.
Right.
Renewals.
Well, in some of our programs, and this gets really into the weeds of the particular programs, but some of our programs, every renewal application is considered a new permit. Now, we don't believe it was the state legislature's intent that we would force retrofitting of every new facility in New York State to meet whatever we came up with. And I don't think that would, meet, I don't think that we're planning to do that. So it is written specifically to apply to new or substantially improved facilities.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to get to this question just in case I don't want to run out of time. But I'd really like you both to kind of comment about what kind of lessons learned or take homes other states or could use based upon the work that you've done.
Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I mean, that kind of question is usually the one that sets you up to describe what kind of mistakes you made, and that's fine. I would say that from a process perspective, the most important thing is to have the right people in the room working on the project. I am not a certified floodplain manager. The state floodplain manager wrote the first draft and retired, left me with it, and because he was not replaced very quickly, there were times when I perhaps could have used more support from someone with the appropriate technical technical expertise. The other thing I think to be aware of is to consider what kinds of data are available when you're developing your guidelines. We sort of looked at Executive Order 13690 as a model, and frankly, probably didn't think enough about whether the data to apply those criteria in 13690 would be available. And in fact, they are not yet available. So that leaves us with the challenge of coming up with workarounds until FEMA figures out how to incorporate future conditions in digital flood insurance rate maps, and we get the state remapped.
I would say probably there's one staff member who did the lion's share of the work on the model local laws. She actually retired in July and moved to Florida. I was on the committee with her as she was working on it. It was also an interagency committee, which is very helpful. DEC helped a lot with these laws. And she started out, she was going to write or glean model laws from different sources. And as she went along, she found that these laws from communities that already had them were just as good or even better than a model, sort of a generic law. So, her main lesson was that looking around for what communities have, combining, pulling out provisions that they could amend their definitions. They could amend, measured, elevations, different things that communities could do. Amend, site plan review and special use permit requirements. So she kind of broadened her thinking about what these model local laws would look like. And I think the result is there's so many. It's almost overwhelming. It's over 400 pages, but there's so much there for all different size communities to see. And, the way it's organized, can look by topic or by function. Is it zoning law? And then so many resources that I mentioned earlier, that I haven't even mentioned, that are in this document. So, it ended up being kind of a compendium and a resource document rather than here's model local laws to use. So.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. Our next question actually is something that I've always wondered and struggled with myself has communicating risk and uncertainty been a challenge for you?
I've been doing this since, 1994. I've been around a while. And I've been on the planning board and the zoning board in my town previously. I've worked with communities at the county level and the state level. It's so hard to they'd say, oh, it's a 100-year flood, or 500-year flood. What? Even my kids won't be alive. It's really, really hard to but then when they flood, they're like, I flooded, do something about it. You know, it's really, really hard to communicate. It's not the hundreds of year flood, it's the 1% chance in any given year. I tried to get my town board to revise their flood damage prevention law using some of these provisions, like, you know, about 5 years ago, after I was off the boards. The couple of the board members were for it. It didn't get voted through. And so there's the fear of, restricting development, especially in a rural area where I am. But it's hard to get people to see the long view. So I feel personally strongly about this, that you've got to have a strong supervisor or mayor who can work with their local boards and feel strongly about, you know, putting these laws through that can serve as the baseline. You know, we're not going to build here, or we're going to help people make their buildings so that they are resilient if they already are there. So it takes strong leadership.
Thank you so much. So I think this is, we have time for just one more question. We have one more minute. And the question is, do your agencies work with the State Department of Health as part of these programs at all? Are there collaborations there?
Well, yes, within DEC, at DEC, we work with the health department quite a bit on a wide variety of programs, but specifically within the climate change program. The New York State Department of Health actually has a climate change unit. And so we rely on their professional expertise. I've mentioned the Climate Smart Communities program a few times, and I should emphasize that is not a DEC program. It's actually an interagency program with 7 agencies sponsoring it, including the Department of State and including the Department of Health. Both are active members of an interagency Climate Smart Communities committee that oversees the development of the certification program and help review certification applications and so forth. So yes, we do work with them closely.
Thank you both for such wonderful answers, and again, for such fabulous presentations.
So,
Marjorie,
yes.
I'll turn over to Marjorie.
So on behalf of all of us here at the Climate Change Resource Center, we really like to once again thank Mark Lowery and Barbara Kendall for taking time from their incredibly busy schedules to share what they've been doing in New York State, which, as you can see, is quite a lot. With us, thank you for sharing that. And this webinar is going to be available on our website along with all the others in the series. That concludes our Climate Academy for the fall semester. We're working on our lineup for the spring. We hope to see you then. And thank you. We're adjourned.